It's Jeff here with JFree906 and the Curse of Oak Island and Beyond live stream. And guess where I am today? I'm at Mari Vineyards, just outside of beautiful Traverse City, Michigan. I came over here today because they have invited me to come back and take a video of the actual tour with Andy. Andy is an excellent tour guide. His knowledge of winemaking and the processes, not only here, but at other places he's worked, is phenomenal. You're going to enjoy this tour with Andy from Mari Vineyards as we explore this wonderful place. Look at this door.
So, welcome everybody to Mari Vineyards. My name's Andy Jacobson. I'm actually the tasting room manager by title for Mari Vineyards, but I'll be taking you guys around on a tour today.
Awesome.
Yeah, so first kind of glance, you get kind of a nice shot of the exterior, both building and some vineyard. We total right now are working with a little north of 70 acres of grapevines, all planted on the Old Mission Peninsula, all owned by Mari Vineyards, all maintained and taken care of by Mutual Farm Management, which is a farm company that is also owned by our shared owner, Marty Lagina. Growing up here on the hillside, we've got a little bit of Pinot Noir and a little bit of Pinot Grigio, as well as Pinot Grigio that kind of wraps around right over here as part of kind of the estate part of our vineyard planting. One of the neat things kind of happening with Mari Vineyards currently is we're in this transition within our vineyards of switching to organic farming. We're big on sustainability. One of the wonderful things that makes the area so good at being a wine producing, grape growing area is the water. This beautiful bay, the Great Lakes, all of this stuff that was formed ice ages ago by glacial movement and created this bay and the Great Lakes are partly what gives us a nice weather buffer and climate moderator to grow and sustain vineyards out on the peninsula. And so keeping that in mind with what we're doing, one of the big things that's important to us is to be kind of a shepherd or steward of the land and of the area. And so our shift to more green practices and organic farming practices was kind of paramount to kind of one of the long-term goals for Mari Vineyards. Now, of the 7 vineyards we have on the peninsula, there were already a few that had been farmed that way for quite a few years, but now pretty much everything is online farming that way, and then obviously we'll be able to have all kind of certified organic stuff down the road. None of them are certified organic yet, but we are farming them with that practice kind of with the intent to be going for certification. If you guys want, there may be a little less glamorous to see, but we can kind of get a little up close and personal with some of these Pinot Gris grapevines. So we'll actually go over this way, Jeff, because I know we can actually see a little bit of some of the grape clusters. This vineyard is part of kind of the Mari estate planting, and then that hillside that we had seen behind us was Bella Vista, which is Italian for beautiful view. But I mentioned these are all Pinot Grigio grapes. You can actually see some clusters that they just kind of probably just missed when they were coming through doing the harvest. But these are Pinot Grigio grapes. First observation on these, as Pinot Grigio is a white wine, they don't look like those yellow, green, white grapes that people typically see. Pinot Grigio has this wonderful amount of pigment and color in the skins. It's not often utilized in winemaking, where the skins would sit in contact with the juice like they do with a red wine. And I'll get into a little bit more of the detail on that later. But we do grow all of the Pinot Grigio right here. You're seeing too the normal kind of happening with a grapevine this time of year. Just like the trees, all the leaves are starting to slow down their chlorophyll production. Plant and fruit ripening and growth is kind of stifled a little bit as the plants get ready to go dormant for the winter. Everything that you kind of see where this line is, there's this main cane kind of tied down. You can see green bread ties. Everything that's coming kind of upward from that is all new growth every season.
Oh, wow.
The main cane part of the vine where it's coming out of the ground out and then tied to that grow line, that stuff will be here all winter long. We'll prune these down just to a little bit above that main cane, and then we'll come back through and do a second pruning when we get through the winter and we're back into the springtime, and then we'll clip that off right down at that main part of the cane, and that's where the bud break will happen for the next growing season. So then all of this new stuff will grow again every year.
Wow, that's amazing. I would never think that. You know, I always thought that it would stay with all those vines like that.
Yeah, no, the leaves will eventually fall off. I mean, even as you can tell, I mean, these are getting, quite brittle at this point. They're starting to cut. The plant energy is kind of not focused on keeping this stuff alive and keeping it going, which is why you're seeing leaves change color and the vines kind of snapping like I did there.
Wow.
All of that is just essentially going to be kind of nil. It's the plant's going dormant for the winter time. And then, like I said, they'll come back through after doing an initial prune. They'll come back through after that winter weather and come through and do a pruning again. One of the big questions we get a lot of times in the tasting room has to deal with the vineyard side of things and vine growth and stuff like that. I touched base a little bit when I was talking about the water. You know, people are often asking with that question of what makes the area so good for growing grapes, the water, what happens to the vines in the winter? And that was a little bit of a crash course on it. We are growing things that are hardy enough to be sustainable in this climate,
Michigan
or in this winter weather. Yeah. Mother Nature is kind of dicey at different times, so we don't always get reliable, you know, springtime and reliable fall time weather. I always call those the kind of shoulder seasons of our growing times, but it's not always reliable. So we do have to grow, and we're in a little bit of a box sometimes to some extent, depending on what perspective you want to look at, on what we can grow. But anything that you're seeing probably in a vineyard that's established in this area is something that's kind of tried and true. And that jibes pretty consistently. If you kind of look east and hop over the Atlantic, we're growing, us and a lot of the other wineries, you know, European vinifera. So you're seeing things like Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Grigio. We're starting to grow Sauv Blanc, some of those other German and Austrian influence things like Gewürztraminer and Gruner Veltliner. And then on the red wine side, you're seeing a lot of like very classic Gamay Noir, Merlot, Cabernet Franc. You know, those are kind of some of the big heavy hitters. Pinot Noir has a pretty good presence in the area, though that might be considered, depending on which day and which winemaker you ask, to be a little more of a challenge to grow, given its thin skin and a little bit more, we'll say, finicky nature. But there is definitely, you know, always that concern of, you know, what is going to happen with Mother Nature from that side of things. And so there's always a little bit of, you know, when you look at a grape growing season, I always kind of say, kind of jokingly in the tasting room, that the winemakers are not kind of content to make a final say whether it was a good harvest, bad harvest, an okay harvest until everything is in. Because it really can change and turn on a dime. I mean, we've had, you know, largely speaking, a wonderful 2022 growing season, and then all the rain we got in October, you know, put a little bit of chaos into it and kind of caused some delays in harvesting. You obviously get, you know, mildew and mold and rot, you know, concerns and things like that. So it becomes a little bit of a mad dash for the winemaking team to kind of put it all together. It's like a puzzle for them. On any given day, it might be a different thing, which is also part of, you know, that's winemaking. So yeah. And if Jeff, if you have questions along the way, don't be afraid to ask. So, one thing to see if you can get it, Jeff, just to peek, there's this little wood ring with this plexiglass dome kind of tucked away in the middle of the vineyard. We have the luxury of the start of the dormant season for us happening, that you can kind of get a peek of it out here. When everything's really lush and the vineyards are all green, it's a little more obscured by all of the vines, leaves, and things like that. What that actually is a little skylight that kind of looks all the way down into the cave system of the building, and we're going to be down there obviously eventually on this tour. So it's always, I think, kind of fun kind of pointing it out while we're up here to be like, hey, take a note of this, because eventually this is going to play into what we're doing and what we're looking. Now, as far as the building goes, we've got this obviously impressive structure of a building. Total, it's about 31,000 square feet. Wow. Now, one neat twist on all of this with our ownership's influence on it is they were diligent to use as many local contractors as they possibly could. So everything down to like our tiles in the tasting room, the flooring, all the stonework, the electrical, the plumbing, HVAC, all of that was done by local contractors. The general contractor was a local guy, the architecture firm local. We were very deliberate and very intentional in kind of keeping that local money local, you know, to build this massive facility. There's a few accents in the building that are not local, obviously, as we couldn't source everything locally. But that said, they were very diligent in kind of doing all of the work. Kind of wonderful stonework that you see on the outside is all limestone from the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. Marty formerly works in the energy industry, among a lot of other interests, like being in the wine industry as well. But it's limestone that came from an energy project that he did up in the UP. They took all of these big massive boulders out to build a wind farm, and to do so with these windmills you have to take out a lot of dirt, a lot of limestone, so you can build these massive footings for these windmills for wind energy to sit on. And as a result of all the kind of blasting out some of the limestone, he had all these massive boulders that he just decided to hang on to. And then when they got into the design part of the building, he was like, we're going to use them on the exterior and do all of this gorgeous stonework.
It is gorgeous too. It truly is.
Yeah, I mean, it's like an artwork. I mean, it's just fantastic looking. The other big accents that you'll see, a lot of woodwork. Marty's a little bit of what I'll call a wood nut. He has access to a lot of this older stuff from just different property acquisitions. Trees that have come down, barns that were on these properties that were existing. He actually decommissioned rather than just kind of demolish and get rid of.
Right.
He saved a lot of the materials, wood, nails, all that stuff, to kind of focus and use in this project. He just had it sitting in a storage facility. As he was getting into doing some woodwork with it, he was like, we're going to start to use some of this on the tasting room project. So when we get inside, tons of what's featured in there, the ceiling wood, the bar wood, our tables, all of that is reclaimed, repurposed wood from different properties and barns.
Yeah, that is. That's truly fantastic.
Look at it.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a woodworker myself. Yeah. I'm also from the UP of Michigan.
Where are you from, Jeff?
I'm from the eastern UP, Sault Ste. Marie area.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Marty was originally from Kingsford.
Yep.
All of, like I was talking, all of the wood in the ceiling, everything, those smaller slat boards, the little cross beams, the big beams, everything is reclaimed, 100% repurposed barn wood. This big beam actually that you can see, Jeff, that kind of meets this left side of the fireplace, is a little over 400 years old. Wow. It stood in a barn for about a century and a quarter, so about 125 years. Wow. When they were setting the beam into the tasting room, they had to lop off a pretty decent sized section of it. It was initially going to be the mantle on the fireplace, but when they cut it, they realized how nice the ring structure was on it that they decided to change course and use it for something else, and they had this table made out of it. Wow. Might be a little tricky to see, but again, 125 years in a barn, and then they took one of these slabs to a guy and he counted the rings in this wood. This was a hand-hewn beam in a barn, but he counted 270 growth rings in that beam. So 270 years plus about 125. Then even on that, you can add 6 years. It's been sitting in the building here. We've been open a little over 6. So we're nearing that 400-year mark. That beam, as far as hand-hewn age of wood, and it was all hand-hewn. Yeah. You can see some of the nice detailed woodwork on the tasting bar. This is all reclaimed ash. As you can see on the edge, where this live edge was. Sadly, the emerald ash borer was kind of doing its work and kind of devastating this tree. So Marty was able to kind of take it down, kiln dry it, and we used it for the tasting bar. All of this slab, the entire run of this bar, was all from one tree. Massive tree, sadly taken out by an invasive insect species. I always think there's a certain amount of irony there that this tree survived probably countless storms, different seasons,
hard winters,
and flowing of hard winters, and grew and grew and grew. And then largely as a vector, it was moving firewood and things like that caused this emerald ash borer to populate the Midwest, among other things too. And then this little bug just kind of came in and did its work and kind of took this species out. And Mari is not alone, and northern Michigan is not alone in seeing the devastation of that bug. Right. I know as municipalities go, Chicago has fought a lot and had to take a lot of ash trees out of some of the city suburbs.
Yeah, that's really nice. And that's really something that, Marty, being somebody who works with wood, realizes the value and, cherishes the value of it.
The history it ties into you said it right there. It ties into kind of a love of history, and just, like we were talking with these trees. I mean, these things weather an amount of time and age, and there's a story kind of behind it that this tree can't tell, and now that it's here, it gets to kind of live another life, and people are obviously fascinated by it. We get a lot of questions. Some people right away are like, oh my gosh, I know what this is, and other people are like, did you guys do this? This is insanely creative, cool, beautiful. We hear all these kind of fun, adjectives to describe it, and we're like, sadly, we did not. It's from a bug, and it took this tree out. Really, worth obviously pointing out. Another big kind of showstopper in the tasting room is this cool cork mural that we have. This was done, another local flair to it. This was done by a gentleman. His name's Scott Gunderson, out of kind of the Grand Rapids area. He's an art teacher by trade in Wayland, a little area around Grand Rapids, but he does these cork mural and portrait work kind of as a side gig to his art teaching profession. He started out a handful of years before we opened. He had made a portrait of his wife that he entered into the art prize competition in Grand Rapids. It was all out of corks. Wow. It was a portrait of his wife. And they always do, if you're not familiar with art prize, it's basically a citywide art exhibit, and you can go around and kind of see through the city, and all these restaurants and businesses house these art displays. And then it's a voting. and he ended up finishing pretty high in the voting, that he got a lot of publication because he was a local guy. And so we ended up getting kind of enough exposure that our ownership kind of found him and was able to kind of commission him to make this portrait for our tasting room. Two big kind of things about it when he did it: we were the first piece of artwork that he did on a commission that stayed in Michigan.
Really?
Yeah, and we were the first non-portrait. This was the first landscape he had ever done.
Wow.
So he was like, I'll be willing to try something different. This is kind of where we ended up.
That's awesome.
Yeah, gorgeous.
It's beautiful.
Piece. Almost 14,000 wine corks in it total. 13,698 by exact count, if anybody out there wanted to know.
Oh my goodness. Yeah,
and it's actually painted underneath what you're looking at, the corks. It's painted on 3 big wood panels, basically just for where the lightest corks are, it's just the natural wood. Where the reddish kind of stained corks are, he painted it gray, and then where the really dark corks are, he painted it black. And it's nails are shot through the back of it, and they're all skewered on nails.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and then he brought it up from his studio. We put it on the wall, and he just had to kind of finish right where the 3 pieces joined. But it's around 15,000 nails in there total, and he said it took him about 150 hours total time.
Incredible.
Kind of a newer addition to the tasting room, we've got these big root cross sections. There's this one from walnut, and then there's another one down here that we'll get another peek at that's made out of maple. Again, this kind of ties in really to Marty's love of all things kind of wood related. And it's all these little accents and details, I think, that kind of give Mari a little bit of that kind of flair that Mari has. You know, you can see some other barn beam work in these tables that we have, as well as any of like the window headers. We've got some other slats from some barns. The other kind of cool fact with a lot of the barn wood is that it's reclaimed stuff from the area, but from Michigan kind of proper. These aren't just like barn pieces he bought, you know, and these were all kind of reclaimed pieces that he got from various area properties and stuff. I had mentioned tables earlier being made from some of the wood that Marty had. This is ash as well. One of the really neat things that they did with the table making is there's a small, almost invisible seam right down the middle of this.
Oh yeah.
But the table is actually a mirror image. What they do is actually what's called a book cut or a book match. So this was a slab half the width, and then it was sliced kind of on this horizontal plane, and then it's folded over, and then they're joined together to make the table. So when you look at it, you can see some of the accents, like these knots.
Oh, absolutely.
Kind of mirror on the table.
Yep.
And the split here, because it was one piece of wood kind of matched together. It kind of seemed like that.
That's awesome.
Another really kind of cool detail that Marty kind of has an eye for, that he was like, I want to do these tables using some of the wood. The wood wasn't necessarily big enough, but he was like, we can do these book matches and have everything kind of make these nice kind of, you know, solid ash tables that we can use, which will be filled with people later. Just watch your step, obviously. So the next level in the building, just right beneath the tasting room, is our mezzanine. We have a kind of adjacent room to where we'll be kind of looking over production that we can use for like bigger format group tastings. We're going to be doing some different stuff in the room kind of through the off season to kind of utilize the space. But this gives kind of a nice bird's eye view of, this is actual where the magic happens, if you want to call it that, where we make the wine. You'll see fermentation tanks, these big stainless steel tanks. We've got some open top bins down here that we actually have grapes and juice and skins kind of in there fermenting, that they have covered just so, you know, fruit flies and stuff aren't getting in them.
Right.
But they'll come through periodically and kind of churn that stuff up and stir it up. Actually, Jeff, if you want to come in here. Like I said, this is kind of that adjacent room that we can use for some larger kind of format tastings and stuff. This is bookable actually online, so if like larger parties want to come by and do like flights, glasses, food, kind of enjoy the space for a couple hours, you can book this actually and do some tastings, glasses, and food and stuff like that. But the other kind of more important fun part of it is you get a little more of like this bird's eye view of production. Kind of directly in front of me, kind of out past where those barrels are, is actually the bottling equipment that we have. We have our own bottling line in-house. As part of being in a state grown and produced winery. We don't just grow all of our own grapes locally. We actually do all of our own processing and production work in-house as well. So this is kind of the finished side of things. The bottling would kind of start kind of on this end, kind of closest to us, just past those 2 wood barrels that you see. Empty glass just gets loaded on those, and it kind of follows a conveyor. It makes like a 90-degree turn away from us and starts to go into that next middle part of the machine. Sorry, first step is just rinsing out the glass so there's no dust or debris in any of the glassware. And then it's filled where you see that almost like lowercase n-shaped blue hose kind of off in the distance. They're gonna hook the wine from one of the tanks running into that part of the machine. There's a carousel that actually grabs the bottles and does a quick lap around, and it fills it as the wine comes around it, and then it drops it back down. The next part past that, which looks like a little bit of a hopper with like a metal top, or sorry, black top on it, is where the closures go. So you would see either corks or screw tops. We do both with our winemaking. As far as using which closures on what wines, it becomes kind of a winemaker decision. And then the wine kind of spins around, and then that very last section that you can see almost straight ahead of us past that cage of bottles is where all the closing stuff happens. There's a closure, a capsule, and then a label put on the bottles. And then they're spit out kind of to the right-hand end there. You can see some bottles actually sitting there and that look like they were kind of newly labeled within the last couple days that the winemaking team is just probably packing up. So one of the other kind of cool tidbits as far as winemaking goes, and it's an obvious thing to look at and see, there's 2 very different styles or shapes of tanks that we utilize.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask you about that.
Perfect. Now, it's a great question anyway. The more cylindrical stuff that you see to the left, and some of the stuff we saw way over there to the right when we kind of came off the elevator, those are going to be white wine fermentation tanks, or primary fermenting for white wines. The ones that look a little more like thimble shaped or upside down thimbles, spaceshipy kind of looking to them, would be for red wine production. The big difference in shape accounts for, with red wines, you're gonna have skins in there during fermentation with the juice. What happens during fermentation, there's a couple things produced. Obviously the alcohol comes out of that fermentation process. The process also gives off a little bit of heat, but I'll come back to that in a second. And then also CO2. So what happens is when there's skins in there, with that fermentation process happening, some of the CO2 is kind of bubbling up to the top, and it's causing those skins to kind of go north with it. And so they form a cap around the upper part of the tank. Now, one of the tasks the winemaking team does is they'll do what's called a pump over, and they'll draw juice out of a tank and pump it over the top so it kind of presses and breaks up that skin cap down into the tank. Now, a few things get accomplished in doing that. The grape skins kind of house some stuff we want out of them into the red wines. One is going to be the tannins, which give the wine that kind of grip or that kind of feeling of drying out your mouth when you have a red wine.
Yep.
The other thing is all the color is in the skins, and so that churning process kind of causes a little bit of color extraction or pigment extraction out of those grape skins. The tanks open up, so when the weight of the wine that's being pumped over kind of pushes on that skin cap, it allows the skin cap to kind of fall down and kind of break apart. In a more cylindrical tank where the shape is kind of consistent all the way from top to bottom, that there's not as much wiggle room for that skin cap as it's kind of formed at the top to kind of break apart and make its way down. And so it can kind of wedge a little bit. Yep. It's just much more, it solves a problem basically of keeping it from being kind of plugged up or gunked up a little bit.
It's amazing they figure that out, you know. And then I was also looking at the difference between the wood kegs you have down here. And then you have some of the stainless steel
stainless
kegs.
ones, yeah.
What's the difference there? What makes why the difference in those?
Some of the wine obviously will go into oak and we'll age in some of the barrels, and when we get downstairs, we've still got another, level down we can go. Some stuff will age in wood, and that's obviously going to give the barrel some flavor. Some stuff will just go into stainless that we'll use for other things. And it could be kind of a couple reasons why it's in one of those little stainless variable barrels. One, it's a volume thing. Some stuff we might have a small enough amount that it's not gonna fit or fill one of these giant tanks. Any empty space in a tank that has air in it slowly would spoil the wine. So the tanks are filled pretty close to the top. During fermentation, there's CO2 being produced, which is gonna bleed out of the tank and kind of keep any backflow of oxygen coming in to, again, prevent spoilage. When they're in a tank and they're kind of stable, they'll actually blanket them with inert gas, just so there's not any oxygen in there, which would render the wine or spoil the wine. It would make it go bad. On a really more micro level, the same thing happens when a bottle of wine is bottled. Once those wine bottles are filled, one of the steps right before it goes to the next part where it gets either the screw top crimped on it or a cork pushed in, the bottle passes under a little nozzle, again using inert gas, that actually shoots a blast of gas into the bottle to displace the oxygen, and then immediately it goes under where the closure is and it's closed.
Wow.
Yeah, so that little bit of airspace you see in a bottle of wine is inert gas. It's actually not just atmospheric oxygen, because that would actually spoil the wine.
I had no idea.
Yeah, that's another one of those little, air becomes kind of the enemy once a bottle's opened, and air can also be the enemy if it's not removed from a wine storage environment, because it can actually spoil it a little bit.
Right. Wow.
So, but yeah, so essentially, like I said, what you're looking at is kind of a volume solution. I mean, wood barrels, aging, the stainless ones will actually house wines that might be in smaller amounts that we just don't have the space to kind of fill up a bigger tank. There's also another purpose to some of those too that we'll discuss a little bit when we get down into the caves. The barrels go through a process that they call topping off. And so we'll use some stuff out of some barrels to go into other barrels to kind of keep those barrels filled up to the top. Because as you have wine in wood, you lose a little bit of volume to evaporation where you don't out of stainless steel. So all of the wood barrels that we're going to see downstairs in the caves eventually go through a process called topping off, so we can make sure they're full and that any wine volume lost during or due to evaporation isn't filling up with airspace. So I'd mentioned earlier one of the parts of the fermentation process was giving off heat. As a chemical process, there's heat created. So where you see all of those dimpled jackets on the tanks, those are actually filled with an ethylene glycol, which is a cooling gel. All of the tanks you see are hooked up into this glycol system to keep the temperatures stable. We have the ability to control all of the temperature ranges on the tanks. So not only does it keep the tanks, from warming up too much, but as part of the fermentation process, like a lot of scientific and chemical processes, there's temperature windows where certain things can kind of happen. Some wines are fermented at a little bit higher tank temps. Some are a little bit lower to slow them down. We can chill the tanks enough to halt the fermentation. And all of that stuff I just previously mentioned has to do with when we want to stop a fermentation based on what the wine ultimately wants to be. When we want to control the speed at which fermentation happens, to kind of control some of the aromatics and overall taste and aromas that'll be there in a wine. It really is a big science class.
It really
if you were one of those kids that was in chemistry and you were like, when am I ever going to use this? If you became a winemaker, you're probably using it. So it's kind of a grown-up practical application of a lot of chemistry kind of weaving in there to get wine basically from vine to bottle. So.
Wow. Yeah. And you might have said this at the beginning, but how long have you been involved in the winemaking process?
So I don't, as far as wine industry goes, it's been about probably like 15, 16 years just for me personally. I worked previous to being at Mari Vineyards, which I've been here since we kind of got going a little over 6 years. I did work for another local winery. I was at Black Star Farms for around probably 9 years or so, a little over 9 years that I kind of helped in a very similar role to what I'm doing here. And really, a lot of the knowledge base that I've gained is it's come from, a little bit of my own personal interest in kind of what I'm doing and wanting to know, but without, credit where credit's due. There's very patient winemakers behind me as well. When I have questions, that I've been like, well, tell me about this, explain this, I want to know this, can I get more detail on this? If they were really busy at different times, they were like, hey, come back and we'll show you, or come back in an hour and we'll tell you, or they'd give me something to read. Here, it's in this, I mark the pages, check these out. So even as I was kind of younger and learning about the winemaking industry and stuff like that, it was just very patient people kind of answering questions for me, like we see when people come and visit.
Right.
People asking questions of us. So it's kind of just become a little bit of a labor of love. I mean, I don't know that I ever thought getting into it that it would probably end up being a career for me. It's just, I always tell people something I kind of stumbled on. But it's been very rewarding. I really like what I do. And it's a lot of fun. I kind of jokingly will always say it's like pizza. Even when it's bad, it's still pretty good. So yeah, it's really kind of more of a labor of love for me. I mean, I like what I do. I get to work in this crazy, amazing facility. We've got a really good team of people. As you can see, some of the winemakers kind of coming in. They are in like the throes of harvest, but they're nearing the finish line. We're getting to a point where almost all of our fruit is in. If not already, I'm not 100% certain what came in over the last couple days, but I mean, they are getting ready to get all this stuff in tanks and get it in barrels where it's got to go. We're getting into the point where all the grapes will be in and there won't be any more physical fruit to harvest. That's kind of where the real work begins, and often I think as part of their job, it's a little bit of the unheralded part. You know, people are like, what do they do all winter? That's probably the most critical steps. They're monitoring fermentations. They're doing those punch downs and pump overs on the wines. They're moving wines from tank to tank, doing some of the clarification process where the wine might not push through filtration right until bottling. There's other things, racking and fining, which kind of help get out impurities and things in the wine that are kind of those solids, or they're going to do some stuff that would kind of allow some stuff to solidify out of solution. So there is a ton of work to be done in the wintertime. The other side of it is we have wines that are not just in a state of production from this fall's harvest. We have things that are aging from a year ago, 2 years ago, that they're monitoring and maintaining. It's a lot of revenue lost if you've got a wine aging for a year and a half in a wood barrel and then all of a sudden something happens and it goes bad where you can't use it. So there's a very, very tactical and very, sensitive process that they're doing in the down season. Though they're not physically harvesting any grapes, there's a lot still happening, which I think sometimes gets kind of lost in translation with people.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, but largely no, they're working. You're probably seeing a little bit of dictation from the winemaking team on what's going to be happening today. We're going from this tank. He's telling him what he's doing, probably pumping over. Yeah, I mean, they're going to have probably a full day, so.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Since you were here last, a local photographer kind of came through and captured some kind of cool shots of Mari, and we were always kind of looking for a way to kind of keep sprucing this room up to make it a little more warm and a little more kind of, inviting to guests. And so we ended up kind of linking up with this local photographer and kind of started to utilize getting him to do some prints.
Is this like the four seasons of the...
That's exactly it. He kind of was wanting to capture kind of the four seasons at Mari. You've got spring, summer, fall and winter, obviously very well represented. What's also kind of cool is he managed to get some different shots of the building too. You're seeing it kind of directionally from some different directions, which I think is kind of neat too. A lot of old stuff too, like the keys on the wall are from our ownership's private collection.
Wow.
One of the other big kind of grand inquiries we often get to is kind of where does the name Mari Vineyards come from? It actually comes from these two folks that you see kind of up in this upper picture. Teresa Mari is the namesake of the winery, and she was our owner Marty's maternal grandmother. That's Grandma Mari up there on the right with her husband, as well as her in-laws. This is his parents, and then this would be Grandma Mari's parents with her brother Angelo. In these frames here, and then actually if we sneak around the corner, you can actually see, this is another picture of Grandma Mari up here, and some kind of old family photos that they got. Grandma Mari was an Italian immigrant from the Umbria region in Italy. Of all places, when you have the world at your fingertips, when you immigrate from Italy, you go to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. So Grandma Mari and the family kind of set roots in Michigan, up in the northern part of Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, specifically in that Kingsford area. They kind of set up and established roots up there. Grandma Mari was a little bit of a home winemaker over in Italy, and she kind of kept that going up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And so the family always kind of got to enjoy some of Grandma Mari's wine and some spirits. She actually did a little bit of distillation during like holiday and family functions. And so Marty always kind of has said that the winemaking is kind of in their blood from Grandma Mari, and she's kind of a little bit of their foray into kind of the wine world. And I actually always like to think of this as being kind of this really nice kind of homage to Grandma Mari and kind of that nod to the family history that she kind of represented, going backwards in time. Specifically to this stuff, this is actually some of the equipment that Grandma Mari used. Wow. Yeah, we've got a little bit of her, this is an old kind of hand crush or hand press. We've got the couple barrels that she would use to age some of the wine. And then I mentioned earlier too that Grandma Mari did a little bit of distilling. That's actually what these two pieces are. Using kind of an old wash tub in an old grease can, Grandma Mari created a little bit of a home still. You could put wine in this and just get it boiling underneath. And what it does is it evaporates the alcohol out. It's got a very low boiling temperature. So the alcohol would vaporize quick and probably first out of anything else into a gas or vapor, and then it would come out of here. You would connect these two pieces with one of these copper lines, and then as that vapor kind of makes its way through into this part of the equipment, you'd notice the copper coil goes all the way down through here. You just fill this with water, and then as soon as that alcohol vapor gets into this part of the copper and it lowers in temp, it condenses back down into a liquid.
Wow.
And at that point you have booze. Grappa specifically. Grandma Mari would distill the wine, therefore kind of turning it into, if you're big into the spirit world, it's basically grappa at that point. Whether red or white grapes would determine whether red or white grappa. But they would enjoy the homemade wine and spirits at family functions.
That's awesome.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah. So it definitely is in Marty's blood to
Absolutely,
have it. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, we do all of the processing when the fruit does come back. We'll take a quick dip out here, Jeff. I'm gonna make sure we don't get locked out though. So I'm just gonna close that guy gently. So when the grapes do come back in, this is kind of where all of it starts. We're set up as a gravity flow facility, so as we move through production stages, we can actually just flow the wine naturally using gravity. We do have pumps and can pump assist where needed, but ideally every part of the process kind of starts and moves lower into the building as you go. The machine here to the right is our grape press. It's a Vilnius made from Germany. We'll load the fruit out of the blue bins when it comes in using a grape elevator. It'll kind of make that long ride up and just go right into the press. To be pressed if we want to go whole cluster and not take the grapes off of the stems. Again, with that, there's another tactile benefit in the wine and some flavor compounds that you can get, phenolics and things like that can give a wine structure. So that would be, again, a winemaking decision on, do you want to go right into the press, you know, with the grapes. The other step before loading the fruit into the...
Now, before we do that, and you said a press, so what's actually, is it actually some sort of a pressing process in it?
It's like a bladder press, so inside there's actually these parts that would actually kind of inflate and squeeze the fruit.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And a cycle on the press is going to take a little while. These guys will set fruit in here, they can kind of come do other things, and then periodically come back and check, because what happens, you notice it's a cylindrical drum, it'll actually rotate the stuff in there. So it'll press it, rotate it, and it can kind of press again. There's always an amount of juice that's kind of naturally there that'll start pressed from like the weight of the fruit, and that there'll be like free run juice, and that will go kind of right into these two metal port doors.
Okay.
They see into the wall, so the juice starts kind of running right down the lines down into production.
Wow.
Now, if we want to take the fruit off of the stems, that's actually this equipment right behind you, Jeff. This rotovib is actually a separator and destemmer, so we can load the fruit right up into the top here. And then what happens is it comes down and it falls through, and probably the best place to look is underneath. It's hard to see, but in through here, there's almost what look like little silicone gears. Yeah. Those will actually vibrate and pulsate and actually take the grape berries right off of the stems, and they will fall through and just catch down into here where they'll get kind of macerated. They'll kind of pipe them into a thing that macerates through this, and then the stems just kind of ride up on the top here and just come out the end.
Now, are those stems and all that, is that kept for like fertilizer or anything like that?
You can compost stuff like that. There is some of the grape component stuff doesn't break down as well.
Right.
We do actually, as far as I know to date, we still link up. There's a pig farmer actually locally that takes the grape skins from us, because those I know break down kind of slow as far as a composting situation goes. And so those, we have compost, but they never break down really fast. And so those don't often make it into the compost piles that we have on one of the properties. And so there's a pig farmer that takes them and feeds them to his pigs. But as far as stems and stuff, I believe those are going to go and make it for part of the composting. So, so now we kind of skip a level. What we were looking at with that bird's eye view is the production or processing floor, which you can kind of see through the windows here as we come through. And again, like I was saying, there's a lot of these bins that are housing some different grapes and stuff in there that the winemaking team will actually come through and do what's called a punch down, and they'll take the lid off, they'll take the plastic off, and they'll actually use just a hand press, and they'll stir that stuff up just to kind of keep that fermentation going. Again, the pumping over process, just like the punch down process, is going to get some of those tannins and some of those pigments out of the grape skins to make these really rich colors in the red wines.
Well, you do an awesome job,
we
by
have
the way.
this incredible facility. I mean, sharing it is part of the fun of what we get to do. So in a wine's lifetime, anything that comes down here basically is going through some sort of, you could call it aging, conditioning. There's stuff happening down here though, whether it be in wood or even as you look over here at some of this stuff, you know, bottles of sparkling wine that are kind of going through a part of a process. It might be hard to see, but I'll hold it up to the light.
Oh yeah,
But you can see there's a cloudiness to these.
Yes.
And what that is there's actually yeast in here. This bottle is actually going through a fermentation. So there's actual CO2 being produced in here. So this will make a sparkling wine. And just that haziness that you see kind of mixed in with the wine itself is actually yeast kind of mixed in there that will eventually be kind of removed out of there to clarify the wine. But we have cages of sparkling wine down here as we make some different drier bubblies that people will come and enjoy in the tasting room. What you're getting kind of a good shot of right now though are some bigger oak casks or properly shtucks that were made for us. There's the smaller one on this end and then it's kind of bookended down on the other end of these four that are 1,200 liter volume shtucks, and then the big guys in the middle are 2,400 liter doppel shtucks. So they'll hold twice the volume of wine in there, and they'll actually house these specifically, some different white wines that we make just to get a little bit of this kind of, you can say light wood influence, but also some oxidative benefits. Wood barrels work almost like a little bit of a slow lung. There's a very slow amount of oxygenation that can occur in a wine when it sits in oak, which kind of softens out things like tannins, acidity, and stuff like that. The same process happens to a wine in a bottle over time, kind of through that semi-permeable cork. When you're aging it, this is just on a little bit more of a macro versus micro level when you have a bottle of wine. But it really, I look at these as being wine conditioning in the sense that there's so much volume of wine in there. You've got a decent sized barrel and surface area, but the amount of wine relative to surface area isn't enough to give the wine that big, powerful oak influence. And so we'll house some things like some of the volume of our Sauvignon Blanc. We do a wonderful Stuckfass Riesling that we age in one of these casks. Our Pinot Grigio will sit in these for a little bit of time, as well as some other things. Our Pinot Blanc, some of the Gruner Veltliner or the Gewürztraminer might have a little bit of its lifetime spent in one of these, just to kind of do a little bit of oxidation to it, just soften it out, round out the edges, gives the wine a little more rounded feel to it. Like here, even on this one, you can see it's got some Riesling in it, kind of chalked down there. It says 2021 Riesling. So that's eventually going to be something that kind of pulls out of that wood and gets bottled up.
Now, what is this actually? I figure it has some sort of apparatus where it's going to be releasing that.
That's exactly it.
Okay.
Yeah. They're a little more ornate devices for it, but it is actually, a CO2 kind of valve pressure release, if you will. It's just glass. There's a little bit of water up at the top to prevent backflow of oxygen, but when these are kind of newly filled and there's a lot of fermentation happening, the CO2 that's being produced in this wood is actually going to bubble right up out of there. And you'll hear them sometimes when you come and there's like newly, fermenting wine put in here. You can come down here and even before you turn the lights on, you can hear these things kind of like bloop, bloop,
like an old percolator.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like a little bit of like a percolation almost, it sounds like, but you'll get this kind of wonderful kind of ornate glass, that kind of is very fitting of how gorgeous this
yes, it is. It truly is. It's artwork.
Yeah, you'll see, like I said, they're housing some different stuff in here. These ones are empty, obviously, they're spun upside down. When
is this grapevine that's wrapped on here?
I'm not sure what they use for the banding on that. The banding, whether it be the metal or some of the matte black ones we'll see later, or the wood, a lot of it's just aesthetics. When you're buying a barrel, you can actually customize these in a lot of different ways. Like you said, you can do, you can customize the trim on them. You can determine how much, how little, if any, toasting you want done to the inside, where they char the inside over an open flame to kind of have some flavors coming out of the barrels into the wines. So there's a fun customization process when they're ordering wine barrels that can kind of be utilized. When we were talking about the bigger casks with the green glass on the top, this is kind of same mechanism, just simpler device. That hole in a barrel is called a bung hole, and then the little stopper is a bung, and then something specific like this device where it's going to allow that CO2 to bleed out is a fermentation bung. And so when we're in the throes of harvest, you'll see a few different things happening with all of these barrels. Some like this are going to be marked. They're just filled with sterile H2O, and it's got just the plastic wrapped bung on there. The barrels have to stay filled even when empty because it keeps the wine supple. I'm sorry, the wood supple, my bad.
which keeps it from leaking. That's
Yeah,
how
exactly.
it does.
If this starts
I
to
always
dry
wondered
out-
how these things would ever stop. You know, it's just wood
How do they
put
stay
together.
watertight?
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
watertight.
It swells
You have
up.
to keep them filled. It's always kind of swelled up. And there's a lot to do when a barrel's going to be used. So this one is filled just with sterile H2O. They'll empty this out. We have a barrel steamer, which is a device they will just plug in here, and it will fill and roil that barrel with steam and sterilize and sanitize it. We don't use anything. We're not using soaps,
No
chemicals to
chemicals.
clean them. Yeah, because it would leach into the wood and then
Yeah,
into the wine.
right.
You'd never get it out of the barrel totally.
Right.
So we'll steam clean it when this is empty. And then it gets filled with wine immediately afterwards. If wine comes out of a barrel, it gets steam cleaned and then filled with sterile water again. So it's always usually cleaned after everything or anything has been in it. Water, steam it, put wine in it. Wine comes out of it, steam it, put water in it. It's just a very
Constant rotation.
repetitive cyclical process. Yep. A good amount of winemaking is cleaning, in that you need to be working in a very food sterile environment. Bacteria can ruin a batch of wine really quickly.
Yep.
Well,
Now these
really-
barrels, you would think going through that process, they would. I mean, what's the lifespan on a barrel like this? I mean,
There's a varying amount of perspective on that. Generally speaking, a wine barrel that's used for about 5 to 7 years is kind of hitting the end of its lifetime, but only the end of its lifetime as far as like flavoring the wine. They just become more what they call neutral. Now the barrel wood is still going to be, if you take good care of it, you're steaming it, you're keeping it supple and filled with water when not using it, better barrel maintenance gives better barrel life. So you can use these things beyond that amount of time, and they're neutral, so they still provide that oxidative benefit to a wine in that it's going to slow down. I'm not going to slow down. We're going to soften out like acidity and tannins and things like that. But it's not going to give the wine like aggressive wood flavor like a new barrel's going to.
Right.
I think the easiest analogy to use in that situation with a barrel that I always tell people is with tea. When you're drinking hot tea and you're steeping a tea bag, typically those are looked at as like a one-time use. You steep it in the hot water for
Right.
any amount of minutes that it requires, and you get rid of it. Could you use that tea bag again? Absolutely. If you did it over probably, let's say, 6 or 7 cups of hot water, from the first one after, say, 3 minutes to the end one, it's going to be lighter in color, lighter in flavor. Barrels kind of do the same thing. Every time wine is housed in it, it's kind of tapping a little bit of that, the flavors, the resources that wood has.
right.
And
Makes total sense.
So after a certain amount of time, they're considered neutral. Now that said, we grow some grape varieties, things like Nebbiolo, very acidic, very tannic. And so keeping some of these older neutral barrels for us kind of becomes part of the spice or the recipe of making some of our wines. And we very pointedly put some of these things in older oak or neutral oak barrels for those reasons, to soften out the acidity and the tannins, kind of based on what we want the end product to
Right.
be.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So down here in cave level, we're anywhere from about 17 to about 35 feet in ground. Up to this point, we've just been underneath the rest of the building, but as we kind of come through here where these archways are, we're getting away from the building's footprint, and we're kind of just underneath the ground. One neat thing with the caves is we exist down here in about a 10-degree window of temperature. It's about 64, 65 degrees right now as we come out of the warmer part of the year. And then over the slow part of the winter, it slowly will dip down to about 54, 55 degrees. So it can be quite cool down here. But that 10-degree temperature range is about perfect for aging wine. And that's why we're in ground for this part of the process. Now, Michigan is very based on Great Lakes and glacial movement, like we talked about earlier. We are very sandy as far as soil, so rocky and sandy, loamy they call it. I like to always use the term glacial till. It's basically the glaciers, ice ages ago, kind of scraped all the good stuff off, and were sand and rocks that were kind of left in the wake of those glaciers. That said, sandy and rocky soil is not an issue for growing grapes, but structurally, it doesn't provide a lot of good structure for making a cave substructure. So you're seeing a lot of this precast concrete, which you're looking at about a 14-inch thickness on all of this. Massive amounts of concrete kind of to house this, but you're going to see a little bit bigger sized barrels. These are kind of the middle scale barrel size that we have. These are 600 liters. They call them demi-muids. Some of the ones over there, depending on volume, we'll have a couple different barrel styles and shapes, and we'll see some more smaller ones down here. Again, this all ties into the surface area component of wine aging and how aggressive you want the oak to be. So you'll see varying things in here. These would give wine a little bit heavier oak influence than what using like the Stux would provide, and a little more in line with some of the smaller barrels that we see down here. And And then most of these are kind of housing some different stuff. So like on this one, you can see it's Pinot Noir. That's kind of housing in there. You've got the little fermentation bung on there. This is from this year's harvest. And so that's kind of, right now, juice actively becoming wine. And as you can tell, there's a lot of oak down here. When we first opened, a lot of this stuff was still in transit. So these caves were pretty wide open, kind of with the idea that they would be just this in a couple years. And you'd see all these barrels kind of filling up the space. And then as we get down here where it kind of opens up, it'll actually continue around here down into another part of the caves. Now normally what you're seeing here to the left, they'll have a lot of these barrels, as they will eventually again, they'll stack them. They sit on a little base that can actually rest on 2 barrels and stack them up. Just like what you're seeing over here, largely these are probably unstacked because they're starting to be filled, they're starting to have fermentations happening in them that the winemakers are going to want to monitor.
And like you said, if it has a cap with no thing on it, then it's got the sterilized water.
Yep, you've either got water in it, or even in the case of some of these ones down here, maybe not to neglect them or overlook them, something like this is Merlot, but it's from 2021, so this is actually housing wine, but at this point the wine has barely any fermentation happening in it, so it's really strictly just aging at this point. And that we don't have to have the necessary worry that there's going to be a lot of CO2 produced in that back pressure that's going to pop that out.
Right.
I mentioned earlier the topping off part of it when we talked about why do the stainless barrels, why some things in smaller volumes. They'll come through over time, and these barrels will actually lose volume. And so the winemakers will come through and they'll actually take this off and kind of peek in, and using a funnel and a bucket, they'll actually pour more wine in here from one of those smaller variables.
Right.
They actually keep track of that.
Oh, I see.
On the wall with the chalk here.
I was wondering what that was.
These are just top off dates. They've got that little circle up at the top left that shows that with that little line of wine across it. Yep. It's just so they know if we're topping off. And they just come through and they date, and you can see that very first one goes all the way back to 2017. Wow. And now they're dating, the last time they were through here was 9/29/2022. And so their goal is to kind of just keep dating all the way along this wall in chalk. And I would assume in eons, if they ever have it full, they've got this whole other wall that they can start using. But yeah, it's basically kind of another part of that process. We talked earlier with the bottling and how important, you know, a lack of air exposure to the wine can be. And the same thing matters down here on this level of a wine's lifetime, or on this stage of a wine's lifetime. And these kind of jump back down here, you see some smaller barrels. Where we have the 600 liters, most of the small stuff can kind of range in size anywhere from about 225. There's some 228s, and then there's some 300-liter barrels that are down here. There's barriques, there's Bordeaux-style barrels, and then the 300 liters would be hogshead barrels that we're going to house some different wines in. And all of that just ties into surface area. Again, you know, these smaller barrels are going to probably be the most impactful as far as giving wood flavor to a wine. And it's not housing a huge volume of wine, so there's a bigger interaction between the wine volume and the surface relative to the surface area of the barrel. And so these are going to see a little more aggressive flavor. Same thing with those 600-liter demis that are behind us now. Those are definitely going to be a much more impactful influence on a wine versus those shtuks that we saw earlier. One of the really cool features of the building kind of happens right down here. One, the sound can start to boom, so if it sounds really echoey for those listening, it's just relative to the space that we're in. But the compass on the floor and the one on the ceiling are actually both set to true north. So as we kind of stand, points northward out this way, the very neat part of our design and really the whole building and influence of the building's location kind of is dictated by the compass. And this line actually here, Jeff, if you see it where it says summer solstice, kind of beneath us and also above us, very specific on this degree on the compass. The sunrise on the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the calendar year.
It's my birthday, actually, by the way.
Right on. Belated happy birthday. The summer solstice, the sunrise comes right up the middle of those doors. We'll open those doors and we'll have this very just gorgeous, like breathtaking sunrise that kind of comes right down the middle of the caves.
I'd like to be here for that sometime. That'd be great.
It's a neat thing, and really, it was one of those things that Marty really wanted to very adamantly have the building have that be part of the focus. It really ties into some of those historical civilizations, you know, like the Mayans, Stonehenge, where these things are very much built in tune to seasonal changes in the year. The summer solstice is always kind of looked at as the welcome to summer, the welcome to the growing season, and being that we're kind of in that farming world, a very critical day for us. And so our building's construction reflects that. Marty was very adamant that when they were getting into the design, it took a little bit of kind of engineering fine-tuning to make sure that it would be able to capture that sunrise right up the middle of the building during or that opening during the middle of the summer solstice.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it seems like something that Marty, you know, would want too.
It's such an attention to detail. So yeah,
that's really it. And I could hear that sound is.
Oh yeah, it's almost like the rotunda, the Capitol building. I mean, it's got that same kind of echoing effect. Worth mentioning where the skylight is above us. When we saw that wood ring and that plexiglass dome, that's above us now. That's actually where this comes out. So we, right now above us, if you go outside of the caves and outside of the concrete above us, all of those grapevines, kind of right where we started, we kind of come full circle. They're right above us now. So all those Pinot Gris grapevines are growing in the dirt, kind of right above all this cave substructure. So, yeah.
So this is the summer solstice sunrise you're talking about.
Now, this kind of predates those doors that are down there that would open almost the entire part of that cave opening. These were before they had arrived on site, and so it's a little narrower opening than we actually get to date. The doors that are down there were actually kind of specially made, obviously, for that cave. They were made out of cedar, so it took a little bit to kind of custom make those, but now almost the entirety of that opening, you know, almost like all the way out to here, opens up.
Wow.
So this was actually still just framed with like 2x4 at the time, and so they ended up, the general contractor came through that morning and actually just kind of like took apart some of the wall so we could do it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. This is awesome.